Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series podcast. In this episode, we spoke with Paul Chinowsky, Professor Emeritus at the Mortensen Center in Global Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. Paul is the Director of the Program in Environmental Design and a Professor of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering at Colorado Boulder. He is currently conducting research in the areas of infrastructure adaptation to climate change and high-performance organization. Paul and I spoke about how climate change is compounding challenges related to aging infrastructure, what kind of investments are needed to ensure North American infrastructure is maintained and climate resilient, the cost of climate change on Canada's critical infrastructure and how prepared Canadian infrastructure is to mitigate the effects of climate change, as well as some of the challenges involved with cultivating the rapid policy responses needed to address the challenges climate change poses to so much of our critical infrastructure. Paul, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining the CDA Institute today. To kick off our discussion, how is climate change compounding the challenges related to aging infrastructure? What types of infrastructure are most vulnerable to climate change, and what kinds of infrastructure maintenance need to be prioritized the most in Canada and North America more broadly?
So when you think of an infrastructure that's in place, most infrastructure was the golden age of infrastructure building was the 70s. That's kind of when you saw huge investments in water systems, in upgrading highway systems, rail. And when you think about that age, when you think about infrastructure as 40 to 50 years old, most infrastructure only has a projected lifespan of 40 to 50 years. So you're already at the point where wearing down of infrastructure, that you're going to have to start renewing it, replacements. So let's start there. You've got aging infrastructure. So you've got bridges that need to be rehabilitated. You've got roads that need to be completely redone, concrete that's getting old. So that's your existing without climate change, your baseline. What climate change does is it starts bringing in extreme factors. So for example, heat. Heat affects concrete by, you'll read about roads literally buckling as the steel in the concrete's expanding, can't go anywhere. So the roads literally just buckle. You'll see bridges having problems again with steel expanding, and it can literally pop apart. And I know that sounds awful, but that's the reality of it. You've got extreme rain or early snowmelt. That's one of the issues that we're seeing now is early snowmelt, which is causing flooding, which is really an effect on our water systems, whether it's wastewater treatment, whether it's drinking water. You're overwhelming plants with literally too much water, and they don't have the pumps and the equipment to move this water to where it can safely be handled. And so you've got a problem then of sewage leaks. You've got a problem where you're going to have contaminated water. The other thing that really begins to come into play is things like air travel. So when it starts getting warm, you don't get as much lift. Now, I know people think, well, Canada, it's always cool. This isn't a major problem. It is a major problem because we are used to the temperatures at which things were normally built. As things get very hot, it changes the amount of weight you can carry. It's going to change that. So every part, whether it's transportation, whether it's water systems, rail, everything gets accelerated by climate change, where things were breaking down. Things will, you can reduce lifespan 20 to 30%. That's a good way to think of it. Something that's supposed to last 20 years now may only last 15 to 18 years. Doesn't sound like a lot when you're talking about a single road. Now think of that across the entire country. So climate change really is an accelerant because the environment in which it was designed in the 1960s, 1970s literally doesn't exist anymore. Typically, where infrastructure is built, it has always been on lower cost land. It's typically on a lower elevation because we use gravity feed for water systems. It is built historically highways in less affluent parts of cities. So highways tend to divide cities. Heating, cooling, right? So those types of things in schools, in public buildings. Difference between more affluent and less affluent areas. What you see over and over again is that there is an inequity based on socioeconomic standing. The better the socioeconomic standing, the better the infrastructure that you have and the more reliable it is. What we're seeing with aging infrastructure and climate change is the result is now a disproportionate impact on lower income areas. Lower income areas have purely a demographic that has been out there for a long time. You see a lot more minority communities and indigenous communities. So it's not that necessarily that infrastructure and climate change is targeting certain communities. What we're seeing is a gap widening, that when the infrastructure was built, it much more favored higher affluent communities. Now, as it's aging and with climate change, you have disproportionate impact on lower income communities. And we're seeing that gap widening. Water systems failing, floods, heat in buildings, cooling, all of these things are disproportionately. In Canada, you have a real issue with Indigenous peoples just not having the infrastructure in the first place. Potential with permafrost thawing. Has a very big impact on communities where you have above ground pipes, and those pipelines are now threatening to fail, or foundations of houses because of that permafrost. That is disproportionately affecting those communities. We've moved from purely talking about mitigation, which is still an important topic. How do we cut emissions? To adaptation. How do we deal with inevitable climate change? Hopefully, we will, through international agreements, minimize climate change, but there is going to be some climate change, and that's going to affect things. So let's start with the easiest one. Let's talk about roads. Roads really are the most susceptible to climate change, whether it's high temperatures on surfaces, whether it's extreme precipitation on erosion. So what can you do? It really focuses on rethinking the design of roads. So roads, the surface of roads, asphalt, it is actually designed for a very narrow gap in temperatures, a very narrow band, whether it's cold or heat. We actually have to go back, redesign the chemistry of those surfaces to make it more either stronger to handle the cold, or make it more resilient to handle the heat. And I'll give you an example of that. People experience potholes every spring, right? People hate potholes. They damage cars. They're just number one complaint. Well, when you have climate change, what happens is the cracks in the road get expanded, gets more severe with warmer temperatures. Essentially, as temperatures get warmer, the surface of the road gets softer, and you're driving trucks over that, and the trucks actually then start breaking up the surface. Well, you get to winter, and everywhere where there's a crack, water gets in there, it freezes in the winter, spring comes and it starts melting. And what does it do? It erodes that base of the road, and you get potholes. So what are you going to do? You're going to now increase the depth, the drainage on those roads. You're going to re-engineer the surface of the roads. You actually have to think about starting to tear up some roads, redesign them, put a thicker base so they drain better, so you'll have a stronger road. Now, that's pretty straightforward. We know how to do that. It gets a little trickier when we start thinking of intense rain, which affects like water systems. Then you have to start thinking about, for example, green infrastructure. You have to start thinking about putting more drainage systems in to hold water. Now, big movement is green infrastructure, where we're thinking of rain gardens. You're seeing more natural drainage on the sides of the roads. That's all designed to hold that water. What you're trying to do is slow it down, because if it just runs off in very heavy amounts, you inundate your water treatment plant and it goes down. So we're putting some intermediate results in to help absorb some of that water. The third thing that's really looking at is the electrical grid. That is a major issue. So the big discussion there is, are we going to underground our infrastructure, our lines? It's a very expensive decision to make, but ultimately, higher winds, more severe storms, we've got to protect it that way.
As part of a study, you analyzed 10 countries with varying income levels to determine the relative impact of climate change in the context of paved and unpaved roads. What is the disparity of opportunity costs between high and low income countries, and what other significant findings did the study yield?
Roads is probably the most fundamental piece of infrastructure when you look at commonality around the world. Roads are such a key part of economic growth and development. Without good roads, you can't get produce from agriculture areas to cities. People have difficulty getting to work. Roads really are a base element of your infrastructure. People tend to think about, electric power and water, key parts also, but everything starts with roads. Without roads, nothing else works. So roads have always been the bottom level, essentially the foundation on which we look at infrastructure around the world. The study where we looked at 10 countries really came about where the question was, does climate change and the cost of climate change to roads impact countries differently depending on their income level? And what we found, we took countries from different geographic regions, different sizes, to match them up. So we took Western European, Italy, we took countries in South America, Asia, and looked at really what was a bottom line comparison. And what you notice is two really key things. Obviously, although we say obviously now, not necessarily when we started, the more infrastructure you have, the more total cost you have. So when you look at, for example, Italy and Japan, their total impact from a pure dollar point is going to be greater. But then we ask the question, well, what does it cost to the countries when you have to start paying for it? Who is it going to impact more? And that's where you find this opportunity cost, which was really a variable. If we have to take money and repair roads because of climate change, it means we can't take that money and build new roads which are going to economically help us. And when that happens, when you start looking at that, it completely reverses what you're looking at. And what you see are lower income countries are very disproportionately impacted by climate change because they don't have a large budget in the first place to work on roads. So you're taking a vital part of their budget and you're putting it towards repair. So the relative impact to lower income countries is much higher than high income countries.
Resilient Analytics contributed to a study detailing the cost of climate change to infrastructure assets across Canada. Is the scale of risk to Canada's critical infrastructure well understood?
Yeah, Canada has some unique challenges to it just because of the sheer geographic size and the different climate conditions. One of the things from that study that was really kind of stood out that made everyone stop and look, what are we going to do with this, was the Northern Territories. There are so many airfields up in the northern part of Canada, and such a dependency of industry on things like ice roads. Well, the warming earlier in the year is going to make it very difficult to access some of these things. The dependence on the reliability of ice roads won't be there in the future. The other piece that was really interesting on this study is the vulnerability of Western Canada, British Columbia. As we saw with some of the heat waves and the more intense rain that's coming, the infrastructure that was designed did not take that into account, right? This is an area that traditionally is very moderate in climate, and all of a sudden you're seeing these big peaks. So you're going to see things like energy demand, roads, you're going to see floods. So really the preparedness is not where it needs to be, not from any fault of we built it wrong. It's just that the circumstances it's in now are very different from what it was 40 years ago. And you're going to see that really across Canada. Eastern Canada is going to start seeing things like freeze-thaw cycles, which tend to break down things like pipelines because of the ground movement. It will hurt runways. So Canada has always had this very stable climate in terms of it has extremes, but it stays cold for extended periods, stays moderate, and we're seeing a break in that. And that's where the critical infrastructure really comes under threat, is that we have these changes and these variations that we never had before.
What can the various levels of Canadian government do to prepare for and reduce disruption and cost of climate change to infrastructure? What are some of the challenges involved with cultivating the rapid policy responses needed to address the challenges climate change poses to so much of our critical infrastructure?
So government response to climate change and infrastructure is a challenge. And the reason is there's a lot of finger pointing that always goes on as to whose responsibility is it. Is this the federal government? Is this a provincial government? Is this a local city government problem? And historically, infrastructure was initially paid for at the federal level and then maintained at the local level. The problem is that model works when everything's working well, when you're not having unexpected maintenance, or more importantly, when you have to replace and update your infrastructure. Then the model, it tends to fall apart because the local governments can't afford these vast increases and they don't have a lot of tools. So the local cities, whether it's a Vancouver, a Toronto, a Montreal, has to then look at the provincial government. The provincial government, this is something that they look at and they say, well, we're responsible for everything outside of your city boundaries, not our responsibility. Federal government, you take over. And so the first thing we need to do is resolve this issue of whose responsibility is it? That's number one. We always have to put that up front because that causes endless problems. Now, what can be done? The first thing that really needs to be done is to re-examine the funding. We need to put a priority on it. So, for example, a priority will be rail. We've got to look at protecting rail against high heat, for example, in Western Canada. So that's really a federal government has to invest in this. What I think you're going to see long-term is a reemergence of public-private partnerships, really getting into the infrastructure investment area, because no single entity is going to be able to afford it. But there's such critical nature of upgrading electrical grids. If we go to electric vehicles, that's going to need a whole different level of infrastructure. So the local governments really need to start thinking about what is the critical pieces of their infrastructure that they can handle, they can fund through local revenue sources, and what's going to be outside their capability. Then you're going to need really a federal level of taking a look at it. And the hard decisions are going to be, how do you equitably give this money, these resources. So, for example, in the US, we have a great example of New York City is $100 billion to protect New York City from sea level rise. Okay, that's fair. Is that where all the money is going to go? Is that appropriate? Same thing's going to happen in Canada. Whether it's sea level rise and you're going to have the eastern seaboard provinces versus are we going to need that money for northern territories? These are issues which you can't leave to the local governments to resolve. You need a higher level. So there really needs to be, I actually think we need to almost have a dedicated office in the government that's now a climate change office that is responsible for this type of decision making, for these type of discussions. We're at that level that it can't be just a lower level decision. It's got to be top of the government level decision.